Welcome back to the Thornvale Parables, where we speak aloud the truths that history buried in dust and shadow. I'm your narrator, and tonight we descend into the soot-choked alleys and sanctified silence of a town forgotten by mercy. Nestled in the valleys of northeastern Pennsylvania, where the fog clings to the bones of old coal shafts and hymns echo without source, stands what remains of Briar Hollow, a mining town built on ash and remembered only in obituaries. The earth here never stopped shaking, even long after the drills fell quiet. But it wasn't the ground the people feared. It was the Murphy name. The Murphy family arrived from Ireland in 1836 with nothing but a wooden rosary, a black-laced Bible, and 7 sons. They were devout, plain-spoken people, immigrants bound to the rhythm of coal, chapel, and coffin. The parish accepted them with cautious grace, as one accepts a relic dug up from under a ruined altar. But it wasn't long before the town whispered of a pattern, a cruel arithmetic that returned every generation. Each Murphy son, without exception, died on the eve of his 21st birthday. It did not matter how he lived. It did not matter how he prayed. Whether it was in the shaft, the river, the throat, or the fire, death came precisely when the boy became a man, always sudden, always witnessed, and always after a confession. This is not a folk tale. The county records, preserved in brittle ink and brittle hands, confirm it. 7 sons, 3 generations, 21 years old, not one beyond. The coroner's ink dries differently on Murphy paper, always a tremble in the final line, always a smudge, as if the hand that wrote it remembered something it refused to recall. But the deaths were not the most chilling thing. No, it was what the boys said in their final weeks, each one with eyes hollowed by sleeplessness and tongues thick from silence would speak a phrase, always the same, always to the priest, though never in mass. I saw his teeth behind the veil. No one ever dared ask what it meant. The priest, Father Aldrich, later replaced by Father Hannessy, recorded it in the vestry's private log, buried in Latin, sealed behind the second confessional wall. But the log still exists, passed hand to trembling hand, hidden even from the diocese. The Murphy homestead still stands, or rather, it leans, a structure half consumed by ivy and shadow, its floorboards swollen with damp sacrament, its walls still etched with crosses turned in reverse. Locals say the bell in the attic tower rings on its own, only once a year, always in late October. Some say it's a coincidence, that mining was dangerous, that Irish families were cursed only by their poverty. But those who lived in Briar Hollow, those who remember the hymns that bled from the mine, they know better. Because every Murphy boy was born with the same mark behind the left ear, a circle of raw skin, shaped like a closed eye. But before we descend further into the hollow, I need to ask you something. The mark itself was never photographed, though the old midwives of Briar Hollow, those veiled women who walked barefoot in winter and blessed stillborns with ash, swore upon their worn black rosaries that each of the Murphy sons entered the world bearing a patch of skin untouched by blood or breath, a pale, bruised circle tucked behind the left ear like a sealed eye, blind but ever watching. The kind of thing a mother might try to ignore until the child turned old enough to ask about it in a whisper, and she would only tighten her grip on the crucifix and murmur something about St. Bartholomew's wound. It was not a wound in the flesh, you see, but a wound in time, in ritual, in something older than family, something consecrated not by the church, but by what came before the church ever dared name its saints. There was a silence in the house, even when laughter should have lived there. Meals were quiet, prayers were longer than required, and whenever a birthday drew near, the family withdrew like a tide of grief around a shore they could not leave. Every 21st candle was lit not in celebration, but in defiance, and extinguished not with breath, but with tears. The parish priest, Father Aldrich, who served longer than any man should, and whose face grew more shadow than skin as years passed, once remarked during a funeral mass that some bloodlines are not cursed, but claimed, a phrase that was struck from the sermon minutes later and never repeated, though those who heard it carried it like a thorn in the brain, bleeding slow understanding into their thoughts for years after. Father Aldrich himself had buried 5 of the 7 sons, and during the 5th burial, young Eamon Murphy drowned in an inch of water in a locked room. He refused to read the usual rites, instead whispering something in a language no one recognized, then pouring black salt into the boy's pocket before sealing the casket. The land around the Murphy home was never tilled. Nothing grew near the house except lichen and low, whispering moss, and the chimney, it was said, never smoked, even in the dead of winter, though a dull light, never quite fire, never quite flame, could often be seen flickering behind the attic slats. And yet the family never moved. Even after the 6th death, Seamus, found beneath the family's chapel floorboards, his body unmarked, except for a look of perfect peace etched unnaturally into his face. They remained, lighting candles that never seemed to melt, attending Mass with bowed heads and eyes that never lifted beyond the altar cloth, and sitting through confessions that grew longer and quieter with each year. There was something unspoken between the townsfolk and the Murphys, an unholy agreement, sealed not by words, but by the simple act of continuing, of surviving alongside a curse, as though the town itself were held together by the weight of not asking questions, of allowing certain shadows to remain untouched, even as they grew darker with every passing year. And perhaps that is why no one noticed when in 1884, the 7th son, Michael Murphy, began speaking aloud in his sleep, uttering prayers in reverse and crying out not for his mother nor his God, but for the parish of Teeth. They say that a child's prayer is the purest form of speech, that its tremble echoes higher into heaven than any priest's liturgy or monk's chant. But when young Michael began reciting his nightly devotions in reverse, his voice low, gravel-laced, as though borrowed from beneath the floorboards of some forgotten monastery, the neighbors stopped claiming innocence and began nailing crosses above their doors, not with reverence, but with fear. "Sanctus devenit ossa," he whispered, again and again. "The holy becomes bone." And though none among them spoke Latin, the sound of it made the glass in their lanterns tremble. His mother tried to hush him, stuffing linen soaked in blessed oil between the boards of his room, and his father, Thomas Murphy, who by then walked with a limp and never removed his hat indoors, spent hours pacing the field behind the chapel, burning pages from an old hymnal in a pit that never filled, never smoked. The term parish of Teeth was never written down, only spoken in the hush before sleep or carved into soft wood under school desks by trembling hands, and yet everyone in Briar Hollow seemed to know of it, even if no one claimed to have heard it before Michael spoke. There were stories, of course, passed between the cracks of stained glass windows and whispered during storm-lit funerals, tales of a breakaway sect during the famine years, Irish priests who'd fled not from persecution, but from punishment, carrying with them a gospel not written in ink, but in marrow, buried in tongues, and extracted through ritual bloodletting. Men who called themselves shepherds of the third mouth, whose chapel had no windows, only mirrors, and whose relics were not fingers of saints, but molars pulled from the faithful. One tale told of a reliquary hidden deep beneath the coal veins, sealed with bone-laced cement, and watched over by those born with the mark, where voice still murmured beneath the earth, soft as lullabies, sharp as bone saws. And when Michael spoke of it, he did not do so in terror, but with the calm certainty of one who had already seen its pews. On his final night, he sat upright in bed, his skin cold and waxy, his mouth full of blood not from violence, but from something within tearing loose, and he said with unblinking eyes, "They sing in the stone now. I go to join them." No one saw him die. The room was locked, the window sealed, the candle unburnt. And yet, when they opened the door at dawn, the bed was empty. The mark behind the ear was burned into the pillow like a brand, and the Bible on his nightstand had been opened to the book of Job, its pages eaten at the corners, as though gnawed by something small, deliberate, and devout. After that, the Murphy house fell silent, but the bell in the attic rang for 3 nights, and in the mine, far below the graveyard, something breathed. And it wasn't coal. The bell, That ancient thing, rusted by a century of neglect and black rain, was never meant to ring again. Its rope had long since rotted, its iron frame twisted by frost and time, and yet, for 3 consecutive nights following Michael's disappearance, it tolled precisely at 3:17 in the morning, not a minute before, not a minute after, each peal low and mournful, as though echoing from beneath the soil rather than from the tower above, and those who heard it, farmers, widows, a blind postman, claimed the sound did not merely travel through the valley, but passed through their bones, like a slow nail driven into the marrow. No one dared go to the Murphy home during those 3 nights. It was said that candlelight flickered in the windows without flame, that the chimney bled smoke that curled downward instead of up, and that the crosses etched above the door, meant to ward off the restless, had begun to fade inward, pulled into the wood as if absorbed by the hunger of the house itself. On the 3rd night, Father Hennessy, who had succeeded Aldrich and who had long believed the stories to be exaggerated folklore, the kind that immigrant towns breed in the silence left behind by poverty, took it upon himself to ascend the attic ladder, a rusted, narrow thing that moaned with each step like the cry of an old organ, and when he reached the bell tower, he found no mechanism moving it, no rope swaying in the dark, only a series of strange indentations carved around the bell's base, like teeth, some small, like a child's, and some wide, split and molar-like, too human to be animal, and too decayed to belong to the living. He did not speak of what else he found there, only that when he came down, his cassock was torn at the sleeve, and his left hand, wrapped in a cloth he refused to remove, would never move again, clenched so tightly in fear or injury that he was buried with its till curled against his chest, as though clutching something invisible, something he dared not release. The church offered no explanation, only silence, a silence that lasted years. And in that silence, Briar Hollow began to empty. Families left with no notice, doors left open, dishes still on tables. The school closed first, then the blacksmith, and finally the parish itself. Abandoned mid-mass, the altar cloth still stained with communion wine that would not dry, no matter how many seasons passed. The Murphys were the last to go, or perhaps they never left at all. For though their house was later boarded and sealed by the diocese, the foundation remained warm to the touch, even in the dead of winter, and more than one traveler claimed, decades later, to have seen a figure, tall, dark, marked, standing in the attic window, gazing out into the fog, unmoving, as though waiting not for a visitor, but for something older to return. And in time, the town itself was struck from most maps, renamed twice, and finally left behind entirely, its roads overtaken by vines, its grave markers sinking into moss, and its silence left intact, unbroken, save for the rare nights when the bell tolled again, though the tower had long since collapsed. Before the chapel was built, before even the foundations of Briar Hollow had been laid, it is said the land had another name, one spoken only in the older Irish tongue, unrecorded and unrepeatable, a name not given by man, but discovered in dream, when the veil between worlds thins, and language becomes closer to breath than to speech. And in that dream language the land was called something akin to Clayom na Fiacla, which, roughly translated, means the blade of teeth, though no historian ever confirmed this, and no mapmaker ever etched it into parchment, save for a single ruined scroll hidden deep in the diocesan vaults of Pittsburgh, half-burned, signed only with the crescent sigil of a forgotten Benedictine order. The first chapel was built by hand, not by clergy, but by miners, men who claimed to have found a void in the stone, an unnatural cavity, a space untouched by tool or erosion, lined with fossilized matter not quite human, not quite known, and within that void, a single pedestal, cut from limestone and engraved with marks older than Latin, resting atop which lay an object never described in detail, except that its removal marked the beginning of the deaths. The men sealed the void with sacred soil, imported from Ireland, blessed in secret by a bishop who would later vanish, and constructed the chapel directly above it, believing consecration would suffice where burial had failed, and for a time it did. But the altar cracked within a year, and beneath the floorboards, rats multiplied with unnatural speed, though none dared speak aloud the word infestation, for it was not chewing they heard in the night, but a grinding, slow, rhythmic, like teeth working through bone. When Seamus Murphy was found dead beneath that very floor, his body perfectly preserved, his hands clasped in prayer, his eyes open and smiling toward the ceiling, the town understood what It had tried so hard to forget that something had been stirred, that the removal of that object, whether relic or root or bone, had not merely awakened a presence, but allowed it to see. For in the weeks following his death, all candles within the chapel burned unevenly, weeping black wax that smelled faintly of rust and riverstone. The crucifix over the altar began to tilt slightly to the left, no matter how many times it was corrected, and the confessional booth grew cold inside, even in the heat of summer, the breath of any who entered frosting in the air like winter smoke. Some say the pedestal still exists, buried deep within the chapel's ruins, hidden behind the third stone of the northern wall, which bears, faintly, the etching of a gaping mouth, not screaming, but swallowing. And those who dream within 10 miles of Briar Hollow sometimes wake with the taste of iron in their mouths, and the feeling of teeth, small and many, pressing gently against the inside of their cheek. And though they never speak it aloud, they all understand what it means. The parish of Teeth remembers. There exists, tucked away beneath the cracked stone floor of a collapsed rectory 2 miles east of Briar Hollow, a book no larger than a man's palm and bound in leather so dark it seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, stitched not with thread, but with what closer resembles fine wire drawn from bone. This is the Black Ledger of Father Aldrich, the priest who presided over the parish during the first wave of Murphy deaths, and whose writings, though never canonized nor publicly acknowledged by the Church, remain one of the only surviving testaments to the true nature of what once slept beneath the valley's chapel stones. No one knows how the ledger was found, only that it appeared one spring morning on the doorstep of the diocesan archives in Scranton, wrapped in coarse cloth and sealed with 3 drops of dried blood in a Trinitarian pattern. And though the archivists opened it with gloved hands and whispered prayers, many refused to read beyond the first few pages, citing dreams of falling teeth, of hymns sung in reverse, and of mouths opening in walls that had no mouths. Father Aldrich, whose final sermons were described as so quiet they had to be felt, detailed in his tiny, perfect script a series of confessions that never made it to official parish records, spoken not by his congregation, but by the Murphy boys themselves, often days before their deaths, each one seemingly unaware that the others had said the same words, repeating phrases that spoke of tunnels lit with flame, of singing that came from soil, and of a figure veiled in smoke who wore a crown of teeth and held in one hand a chalice full of ash, and in the other a lock of hair described always as belonging to someone they had never met but somehow remembered. What makes the ledger so horrifying is not just what is written, but what is not. Whole pages left blank, margins stained with waterment, arcs in the shape of open mouths, and paragraphs abruptly ending mid-sentence, followed by long scratches in the paper, as though the pen had continued without the writer's will, driven not by thought but by something beneath thought, something nearer to instinct or hunger. In one entry, Aldrich describes waking from a dream in which he stood before the parish altar, only to find the church pews filled not with his parishioners, but with rows upon rows of silent children, all with the mark behind their ear, all weeping black tears that left no stain upon their faces, only upon the wood, as if the tears were not water, but ink trying to write itself into the grain. He ends that entry with a sentence scratched so deeply into the page that it tears through the leather backing. The bloodline was not chosen, it was offered. And while the church dismissed the ledger as a forgery, or worse, as the ramblings of a man slipping into madness, they still placed it in a vault lined with salt, blessed the room every 3rd Sunday, and forbade its reproduction under pain of excommunication. Because even the church knows that madness, when consistent, begins to resemble memory. The mines beneath Briar Hollow, first dug in 1839 and long since collapsed, were never considered remarkable in yield or construction, producing only modest veins of coal and the occasional relic of pre-industrial stonework. But as time dragged forward and death crept into every tunnel, there grew whispers among the older miners, those with gray in their beards and scripture tattooed over their hearts, that certain shafts were not carved by men, but discovered, pre-existing, clean-cut into the rock with impossible symmetry, sloping downward, not in jagged spirals as nature would demand, but in perfect, descending arcs like the inner coil of a shell, and that those who descended far enough into those depths spoke of a breath, slow, rhythmic, cold, pushing back against their lanterns as if the very mine exhaled beneath them. They called it the mouth. It was not marked on any official company map, of course, for the coal magnates that owned Briar Hollow. Men whose suits bore silk linings and whose eyes reflected candlelight too sharply had long since learned to ignore the warnings etched into the margins of mining records, choosing instead to seal off the deepest shafts and invent tales of flooding, gas pockets, or collapse, rather than acknowledge what one foreman dared call the throat of the earth in a letter never sent, found later under his bed beside a rosary scorched black at the crucifix. Those who ignored the warnings, young men lured by bonuses, desperate fathers with mouths to feed, often returned hollow-eyed or not at all, and those who did survive their descent into the lowest corridors sometimes reported hearing hymns that did not echo from above, but from below, sung in a dialect no one alive could place, accompanied by a rattling that was never explained by stone, tool, or bone. And always they came back marked, not with bruises or scars, but with an aver, scion to light, a refusal to speak above a whisper, and the same mark behind the ear, red, raw, perfectly circular, as though something had pressed against them in the dark, not biting, but branding, claiming, as if the mine itself had reached up with unseen hands and touched them with the authority of a forgotten sacrament. It was Thomas Murphy, the patriarch of the bloodline, who was said to have found the first forbidden shaft while searching for his youngest brother, who'd gone missing after claiming he'd seen a staircase carved into the wall of the mine that led not up or down, but inward, as though the stone had been hollowed not by pickaxe, but by ritual, and Thomas, against the warnings of his crew, followed the sound of singing until he found the opening. He was gone 3 days. When he returned, he said nothing. He walked straight home, and from that day forward, his left hand never opened, not even in sleep. Years later, when he died, on the very night of his son's 21st birthday, his fist was pried open by the undertaker, revealing not a relic, not a coin, not a tooth, but a single, dried eyelid, still warm, still weeping. It was on the first night of November in the year 1863, a night remembered by those still alive to whisper of it as the vigil without smoke, that the Murphy family gathered to celebrate what should have been a humble birthday supper for Declan, the second son of Thomas and Bridget, who had come of age beneath the long and withering gaze of the hollow valley, his shoulders bowed not from labor, but from a kind of inherited gravity, the kind that cannot be prayed away, only endured. And though the table was laid with boiled roots and black bread and a single pale cake dusted in river sugar, it was the candles, 21 of them, each hand dipped in beeswax and anointed with oil from the sanctuary lamp, that drew the family's gaze, not for their warmth, but for the way they seemed to resist the air itself, burning steadily in a room with no draught, as though sealed off from time. No one spoke of the date. No one mentioned the pattern. But in each Murphy eye was the dull gleam of resignation, and in every motion, the passing of the bread, the folding of hands, the blessing said in trembling Latin, there pulsed an undertone of ritual, a script rehearsed too often, as if this supper were not a celebration but a vigil, a performance for unseen watchers seated just beyond the candlelight. Declan himself sat still, his eyes ringed with weeks of sleeplessness, his skin drawn tight across his cheekbones, and though he tried to smile, tried to raise a toast in honor of his father, who now spoke rarely and only in fragments, his hand shook as he lifted the cup, spilling wine that hissed when it touched the linen, as though the cloth recoiled from it. At the stroke of midnight, the final candle, placed in the center of the cake, flickered, not from wind, but from sound, for across the fields, beyond the old fence carved with crosses, the church bell rang once, though its rope had long since been cut and its tower declared unstable by the diocese, and in that moment every candle in the room extinguished not in succession but all at once, plunging the house into a darkness so complete that it seemed to pulse inward, like breath drawn through a mouth too large to be human. They found Declan the next morning seated still at the table, his face calm, his eyes closed, and the mark behind his left ear no longer red, but blackened, as if burned into the skin with iron. The rest of the family said nothing, not to the priest, not to the neighbors, not even to one another, for they understood, perhaps better than the church ever could, that this was not an isolated tragedy, but the fulfillment of an ancient promise, one inked not in blood, but in shadow, and sealed by the earth itself. In the months that followed, not one Murphy entered the chapel again, and the altar, though untouched, began to sag at the corners, its stone darkening as if absorbing something from the air. And the grave they dug for Declan filled itself with water before they could lower the body, and no matter how much soil they poured in, it never sank. Among the oldest artifacts found in the sealed vestry chamber beneath the abandoned parish was a scrap of parchment no longer than a child's arm, its edges singed and its ink faded to the color of dried blood, containing what appeared to be the fragment of a hymn, half written, half erased, a liturgical chant in a script older than Latin, perhaps Proto-Celtic. Perhaps something unspoken since the era of stones that bled, and though the church archivists catalogued it with the dry indifference of bureaucracy, one novice, a pale boy from Avoca with trembling hands and a gift for languages, translated the surviving lines before vanishing in the night, leaving behind only a single page of notes and the faint echo of song still trapped within the stone walls. The hymn, if it can be called that, began with what appeared to be a summons, not to God, nor to any known angelic order, but to something referred to only as sedis dentium, the seat of teeth, a being or force or altar whose presence was invoked not for protection, but for remembrance, as though to forget it would be a greater sin than to worship it. And the lyrics, once translated, flowed not with praise, but with submission, offering the body not as a vessel, but as a dwelling. O mouth beneath the altar stone, it read, devour in me the marrow of memory, and speak again through my children's tongues. It is this hymn that appeared again and again in the black ledger of Father Aldrich, scrawled in margins, scratched onto the wooden panels of his confessional booth, and even, some claim, found engraved behind the mirror in his private quarters, which had been shattered inward as though something had looked out, not at him, but through him. After the death of Declan Murphy, the hymn took on new life in Briar Hollow, not sung aloud, for that would have been madness, but heard, faintly, in the spaces between silence, in the groaning of floorboards, in the shifting of stones at night, in the distant rustle of wind that carried no leaves, and in the ticking of clocks that had long since lost their hands. Children who had never been taught Latin began humming the rhythm in their sleep. Candles left unlit bore the soot patterns of mouths, and in the graveyard, grass ceased to grow over the Murphy plots. One woman, a seamstress who lived alone on the edge of the old village, claimed she heard the full hymn once, on the night her son turned 21, sung not by voices outside, but by the teeth of her dead husband, still kept in a box in her bedroom drawer. And when she opened the box the next morning, each molar had cracked in half, revealing scripture inked into their core. She spoke of this only once, and the next day she was found outside the Murphy house, her mouth sewn shut with rosary wire, her eyes turned inward. The unfinished hymn was never completed, nor should it be, for it was never meant to end, only to continue, one verse for each generation, one stanza per son, until the altar was fed enough to open fully. And somewhere beneath the parish ruins, a choir waits. They say the choir was never seen, only heard, but not with the ears, no, for those who claimed to perceive its music spoke not of melody or voice, but of a sound that moved beneath language, vibrating through the soles of the feet when one stood too near the chapel ruins, or seeping through window panes in the dead of night like a fog made of breath, like something exhaled not from lungs, but from soil, and those who heard it, always alone, always at the hour between waking and dream, described it as a resonance deeper than hearing, a layered harmony of weeping and hunger, as if 100 mouths were open in prayer, but none were asking for grace. It is said that the earth remembers everything that is buried in it, not only the bodies, but the intentions, the secrets whispered at gravesides, the sins pressed into soil like coins into flesh. And in Briar Hollow, the land beneath the Murphy plots had grown thick with remembrance, swollen with centuries of silence offered as sacrifice. And it was beneath that heavy memory, deep in the old mine shafts where no flame could hold, that the choir first began to stir, not as song, but as breath, a slow rhythmic pulse like the tide drawn back into a mouth too vast to name. Miners once spoke of a cavern so deep that no echo returned, a space so utterly still that even the clinking of tools sounded distant, distorted, as if swallowed mid-air. And those who wandered too close reported hearing murmurs, never loud, never clear, repeating fragments of the same reversed hymn found in Father Aldrich's ledger, only this time not in ink, but in vibration, carved into the bones of the stone itself, as if the mine had become not a passage, but an instrument through which something ancient hummed itself back into being. No birds nested near the site. No vegetation took root. And though the entrance had long since collapsed in a documented cave, those who approached the area on moonless nights claimed to see flickers of light, dim, amber glows like candles carried deep underground, moving in rhythm as though held aloft by hands that no longer bore flesh, forming a procession of devotion towards something sealed, something waiting, something too sacred or too profane to speak its name aloud. In 1901, a young seminarian named Elias Fenwick, dispatched from the Benedictine Seminary in Latrobe, visited the site under orders to investigate the remaining records of the Murphy family, and after 3 nights alone in Briar Hollow, he returned barefoot and silent, his tongue scarred with symbols resembling dental imprints, and his eyes swollen shut not from injury, but from something behind them forcing its way forward, as if what he had seen could not remain behind glass, and would rather blind him than be witnessed again. He never spoke a word thereafter. He simply sat in the monastery gardens, day after day, humming a low, continuous tone. And the monks who cared for him began to hum it too, one by one, until the abbey closed its gates without announcement, and the bells stopped ringing. There are, hidden in the margins of forgotten diocesan inventories and old Irish immigration ledgers, scattered references to a symbol known as osub velum, the mouth beneath the veil, described not as a written glyph, but as an imprint, a negative space left behind on skin, wax, and even stone, always in the shape of an open jaw partially obscured by cloth, as though the act of witnessing it fully would invite desecration. And it is this symbol, whispered of only in the most private confessions and silenced epistles, that came to be known among Old Hollow families as the mark of the veiled mouth, a sign not of curse, but of covenant, passed through bloodlines like a secret no one ever agreed to keep, yet no one dared betray. The Murphy family bore it more visibly with each generation, not just behind the left ear, but on walls, in birth linens, on the frost that formed on windows when no child had breathed there in days, and always on the doorstep, each time a son neared 21, etched faintly in dust or ash, not drawn, but revealed, as if the house itself were exhaling memory. Scholars who later studied these occurrences, under the guise of folklore collection, noted that the symbols seemed to emerge spontaneously during times of deep spiritual tension. Funerals, anniversaries, vigils, especially when held near soil that had previously been consecrated but later abandoned, suggesting that the mouth was not only a presence, but a threshold, a place through which something passed, but also where something could be received, a sacrament inverted, a communion drawn not through bread and wine, but through inheritance and silence. It was during the 3rd generation of Murphy sons that the mark first appeared on the flesh of the living, not behind the ear, but inside the lower lip, discovered by a midwife who, attempting to soothe a wailing infant, lifted his lip in recoil, led upon seeing a perfect row of tiny sigils, shaped like molars and inscribed as if with a quill of bone, each one aligned in a semicircle of faintly raised skin, as though the child had been kissed by the parish of teeth before breath ever reached his lungs. The midwife vanished 3 nights later. Her home was found empty, her rosaries unstrung, and the pages of her devotional book gnawed at the corners, yet no prints, no trail, no sign of struggle could be found. Only a single white candle, unlit, placed at the foot of the Murphy doorstep, wax dripped in the shape of an open eye. From that year onward, no priest would baptize a Murphy boy without gloves, and the holy water in the font nearest their pew turned cloudy during Mass. Even visitors, unaware of the family's legacy, began to report dreams after dining in their home. Dreams of mouths sewn shut, not with thread, but with hymnal ribbon, of altars built of teeth, of sermons spoken not in words, but in the cracking of joints. And those dreams, they said, always ended the same way: a veiled figure lifting the cloth, not revealing a face, but a mouth, and behind that mouth, rows upon rows of smaller mouths, all smiling, all waiting, all silent. Among the relics once stored in the ossuary beneath the Briar Hollow Chapel, long before it was sealed by the diocese and entombed in silence, there existed a small glass reliquary, no larger than a child's skull, containing what was believed to be the sanctified dust of an unnamed martyr, a powder so pale and fine that it shimmered faintly in darkness, as if each grain still remembered the flame that had rendered it to ash, though no official record could identify the saint from whom it had come. And no priest ever spoke his name aloud, referring to him only in the third tongue of the seminary as Sanctus Quiesco, or He Who Rests Beneath, a title that raised more questions than it answered, especially when it was discovered that the reliquary was never meant for display, but had been hidden beneath the altar stone, wrapped in velvet stitched with molar-shaped runes and sealed with wax made not from bees, but from rendered marrow. The reliquary, when examined, gave off no heat and no scent, but those who held it reported a tingling in the gums, as though their teeth were shifting slightly, rearranging themselves in silent anticipation. And one deacon, a young man recently ordained and eager to serve, claimed that when he looked into the dust, he saw within it not particles, but eyes, hundreds of them, blinking slowly in perfect synchrony, each one fixed upon him with the serene focus of prayer, though whether it was reverence or hunger he could not say, for his mouth had gone dry and his tongue felt heavy, as if it belonged to another. Shortly after this encounter, the reliquary vanished. The altar was found overturned, its linen stained with something darker than wine, and etched into the stone beneath was the outline of a human figure, not carved but burned, as if someone had lain there for hours while the stone remembered every contour of their body, including, most disturbingly, a gaping void where the mouth should have been, not erased but left open, as though the stone itself had been asked not to bear witness. Following the reliquary's disappearance, the chapel began to decay from within. Stained glass wept without rain, bees swarmed around the crucifix only to die mid-flight, and the candles, always the candles, would light themselves at dusk, flickering in unison with a pulse that seemed to echo from beneath the floorboards, a rhythm that, when counted, aligned perfectly with the 21 years given to each Murphy son before the breath was taken. Old women began to say prayers backwards without realizing it. Infants baptized in the font developed teeth too early, some born with molars already in place. And in one terrible instance, a corpse prepared for burial by the parish sisters was found in the morning to have cracked its own jaw wide open, dislocating both sides as if singing, silently, into the veil. The unnamed saint, if saint he ever was, had never performed miracles, had no feast day, no patronage, and no shrine. But his dust remained long after his name was lost, and those who breathed it in, even unknowingly, began to dream of staircases carved into bone, descending into chapels where every pew was occupied by smiling skulls, and the only sound in those dreams was chewing, always chewing. Long after the parish was abandoned, long after the Murphy name had turned to a whisper that only the ground remembered, the rectory remained intact, its shutters drawn, its doors chained, its windows covered with thick linen from within, as though the building itself understood that to fall into ruin would be an act of mercy, and so it remained, upright and undisturbed, preserved by something more than stone and timber, something watching, And at the heart of that building, past the study lined with blistered books and the dining room where the Last Supper of Father Aldrich had gone uneaten, was a room none dared enter. The third-floor chamber with the door of white oak and a single cross nailed upside down, not in mockery, but in restraint, as if the symbol itself had been forced into silence. The room had no keyhole, no visible hinges, and the only window was bricked from within. Yet on certain nights, particularly those aligned with the deaths of the Murphy sons, a faint sound would echo from beyond the door, not a scream or a voice or even a hymn, but a kind of clicking, like teeth tapping gently against wood, in rhythm, patient and precise, as if rehearsing something never meant to be performed. Records suggest the room had once been used for confession, though it bore no booth, no kneeler, only a single chair placed in the center atop a floor blackened with ash, and according to an entry in Father Hannessy's diary, which ended abruptly with the words, "It smiles through walls," the chair had a peculiar trait. It always faced the corner, no matter how many times it was turned toward the door, as if the space demanded that whatever entered must never see what waited behind it. Those few who entered the room and survived, 3 are known, one a nun who would never speak again, one a gravedigger who walked backward until his death, and one a mute child found scribbling open mouths onto the walls of the village school, claimed that the air inside was too thick to breathe, yet nothing stirred, that the light would not enter even with candles lit, and that the walls bore the scent of sugar and blood, as if something holy had fermented in the dark for centuries. But most chilling of all was the tapestry nailed across the back wall. At first glance, it seemed to depict a traditional crucifixion scene, with a robed figure hung between 2 trees, flanked by weeping women and robed men. But upon closer inspection, the figure bore no face, only a yawning mouth where the visage should have been, and each bystander, instead of eyes, had rows of tiny mouths blinking open and closed in silent chant. Beneath the tapestry, stitched in gold thread and almost invisible, were the words Domus Dentium, House of Teeth, and when the tapestry was removed in the year 1912 by a visiting bishop, the plaster behind it crumbled, revealing not wall, but bone, polished and shaped into a single word. Welcome. The bishop resigned within the week, claiming no house of God should speak, and no one opened that room again. There was a lantern kept by the rectory door, forged in the old style with panes of thick, rippled glass, and a hook shaped like a shepherd's crook, meant originally to guide visiting clergy through the midnight fog that clung to Briar Hollow like a shroud. Yet over the years, it came to serve a different purpose altogether, hung not as welcome, but as warning, for its flame, once warm and golden, began to change, shifting over seasons from amber to white, then white to blue, and eventually to something pale and flickering that gave no heat, only a cold illumination that seemed to make the shadows around it darker, deeper, and far more deliberate, as though the light itself were not repelling the dark, but feeding it, coaxing it into new shapes. The first to speak of this transformation was Sister Mora, a nurse who had returned to the hollow to tend to the last of the parish caretakers, and who, upon entering the rectory late one October evening, paused at the sight of the lantern not merely lit, but pulsing, its light undulating like breath, casting silhouettes that did not match the surrounding objects, figures that moved when she did not, that reached for her with gestures half-formed and deeply familiar, like the memory of a touch she had never received but always feared. Later, she described the flame as inverted, not in direction but in essence. Where most flames consumed, this one seemed to give something back to the air, a scent, a sensation, a kind of heaviness that settled in the lungs, as though breathing near it was akin to taking in smoke from something that had already died, but had not yet stopped burning, and she noted, half in awe, half in dread, that when the wind blew hard enough to extinguish every other candle or torch in the village, this lantern flared brighter, burning against the current as if drawing oxygen not from the wind, but from something deeper, perhaps even from the silence itself. In time, it became a measure. If the lantern remained unlit, the house was safe. But if it flickered, just once, even briefly, something had crossed into the threshold, something not of flesh, yet still bound by blood. And so the villagers, few as they were, began to keep their distance, crossing themselves whenever they saw it burning, whispering old Gaelic psalms and leaving their dead unblessed, too fearful to invite what might come should the lantern respond. The most chilling tale came from a man named Ephraim Callow, a drifter who wandered into the hollow in 1919 and dared sleep on the porch of the rectory, claiming ignorance of the place's reputation. He later told a railway guard that he had awoken in the dead of night to see the lantern burning, not with flame, but with what he swore was a single open eye, suspended within the glass, blinking slowly, casting its gaze across the yard, and that beneath its glow, every stone in the garden had turned to bone, vertebrae, rib, tooth, arranged in spirals that pulsed like breathing. He never returned. And when asked why he left his possessions behind, he replied, "I felt it see me, and I didn't want to know if it remembered." There was, in the final generation of Murphys to walk the hollow before the parish sealed its last door, a boy named Emmett, born under the ash moon in a storm that broke the spine of the chapel's steeple, who from the moment he drew breath seemed untouched by the usual fragility of life. For though he was pale and narrow-boned, quiet even in infancy, he never fell ill, never bled long from cuts, never bruised or cried in pain, and as he grew, his family began to speak of him not with affection but with reverence, or perhaps with fear, for in Emmett's presence the air seemed to still, flies ceased to buzz, and the house grew quieter, as if the hollow itself paused to listen each time he entered a room. He was the youngest of 4, and yet, as the years passed, it was not his older brothers who bore the mark behind their ears, but Emmett alone, his circle darkening from faint rose to deep umber by the time he was 9, and with it came a strange resistance to injury. A fall from the hayloft left him unbroken, a fever that took another boy in town left him merely flushed, and once, when he was bitten by a rabid fox, the wound closed in seconds, leaving behind not a scar, but a tooth-shaped birthmark that his mother, Bridget the younger, refused to acknowledge even as she traced it each night in trembling prayer. The priest at the time, a weary man named Father Rourke, who had inherited more than just the keys to a dying church, attempted to anoint the boy with oil, but found that the chrism would not adhere to Emmett's skin, instead sliding off in droplets that steamed faintly upon contact with the floor, as if the child repelled sanctity not by choice, but by nature, as though his body had already been anointed by something far older and deeper than the rites of Rome. When Emmett reached his 21st year, the family prepared for the end with grim ceremony, having buried Howe. His brothers before him in graves that would not hold flowers and attracted no birdsong, but as the clock passed midnight and the bell, long silent, remained still, nothing came, no wind, no toll, no death, and for 3 days thereafter, Emmett did not speak. He wandered the hollow barefoot, eyes wide and unblinking, resting his hands on trees, stones, doors, as though he were listening through his palms. And when he finally returned to the house, he did so with a strange serenity, saying only that the mouth beneath had spoken his name. But not to claim him, to invite him. He did not die. He simply ceased aging. For decades he remained 21, and those who glimpsed him, still boyish, still marked, said he moved like someone remembering how to walk, like something wearing skin not its own, and when he passed a mirror, no reflection followed, and in the room where he slept, the walls began to sweat. Not water, but dust, bone white, fine as breath, and always in the shape of teeth. Long after the last rites were whispered in forgotten corners of Briar Hollow, long after the ground had hardened around the graves of every Murphy son, and even the air itself refused to carry their names, a surveyor named Tillman Shaw, sent by the state to inspect the integrity of the old parish foundation before the land could be sold or condemned, descended alone into the ruined crypt beneath the chapel with little more than a rusted lantern and a sketchbook, unaware, or perhaps disbelieving, of the history that lay curled in the bedrock like a slumbering mouth. And it was he who first recorded the great hollow beneath the altar stones, not a chamber dug by hand, but a natural cavity in the rock shaped so perfectly like a human throat, descending narrow and coiled, walls smooth and wet to the touch, that he wrote in his field notes, "I do not believe this is a geological formation. It feels inviting." Tillman described a space that echoed without sound, a shaft in which no voice could carry and no breath could linger. And as he descended further, careful not to disturb the slick, glistening ledges beneath his boots, he began to hear not noises but sensations. Thoughts not his own blooming behind his eyes like prayers whispered too many times, and within these thoughts were images. Pews lined with bone, a chalice of ash passed hand to hand, and always the low rustling of mouths opening in the dark, not speaking, not even breathing, just waiting. The sketches he made grew more frantic with each page, transforming from careful notations of stonework into fevered renderings of teeth, row upon row, impossibly small and curved inward like hooks, forming not a jaw, but a seal, a gate that opened only once when called by blood. He never completed the survey. When the sheriff's men arrived 3 days later, following the signal of his broken lantern found at the mouth of the descent, they found the crypt choked with dust, the floor scratched with the word "never," repeated dozens of times, clawed into the limestone as if by nails or bone, and just beside it, Tillman's journal, its final page soaked in something black and sticky, bearing only one sentence, written in trembling ink. "It has learned how to swallow without closing." The cavity, dubbed the throat by those who catalogued it, was filled with holy soil and sealed with iron. But each year thereafter, without fail, on the feast day of St. Bartholomew, the iron sweated blood. No one would speak of this, not aloud, but the documents remain, tucked in the basement of the diocesan archive, locked in a drawer labeled "restricted," "posthumous," and in the margins of one letter, addressed to the bishop and never sent, a trembling hand had scrawled, "It was not a chapel built upon a mine, it was a mine built beneath a chapel, to keep it from rising." And now that the ground is shifting again, and the crypt doors creak on hinges they no longer possess, the question remains, if the foundation was a throat, what then was the steeple, a tongue, or a scream caught in stone? As the decades passed and the hollow was all but erased from maps and memories alike, the fields that once surrounded the rectory, wheat-blown and whispering in the wind, began to change, first in subtle ways. The way the soil seemed to resist the plow, the way footprints vanished too quickly, or the way the wind would die down entirely when one stood alone too long near the fence line, as if the air itself had grown watchful. And then, more visibly, when the earth began to push up unfamiliar shapes, small and pale and perfectly smooth, mistaken at first for pebbles or roots, until one farmer, brave or foolish, unearthed a full set of human molars from beneath a sickle of grass where no grave had ever been marked. The incident was reported to no one, for the farmer, a man named Otis Healy, had lived in the hollow long enough to know that what the land offers unasked should never be named, only returned. But curiosity clawed at him, and he collected the teeth into a tin box and hid them beneath his floorboards, only to wake the following morning with blood on his pillow and a single tooth missing from his own mouth, replaced, not with absence, but with another, smaller tooth nestled inside the socket, as if something had grown inward, reversing the natural order of things, drawing the body not toward life, but toward hunger. He was found a week later, mouth gaping, jaw shattered from within, surrounded by a perfect circle of freshly unearthed teeth that glistened despite the lack of rain, and the soil around his home was later described by the only coroner willing to step foot on the property as soft with memory. For each time a shovel touched it, it whispered, audibly, a word that no one could understand, yet every man present claimed to recognize. After that, no one tilled the fields again. But the teeth kept rising. Some came in singles, embedded in moss or nestled in the grooves of tree roots, while others emerged in clusters, arranged in neat little rows, as though waiting for a jaw to receive them. And each time one was found, something nearby died. A calf stillborn, a dog collapsed mid-run, a songbird stiff and falling from a branch it had not yet left. And though no one could prove a connection, the villagers understood. The fields had ceased to grow grain. They grew only remembrance. One child, playing too near the tree line, returned home with dirt under her fingernails and 3 small molars clenched in her fist, claiming she had found a smiling seed, and when asked where she'd buried it, she simply pointed to a patch of earth where no grass would ever grow again. Years later, a visitor, an academic seeking to debunk the Murphy tale, took one of the field's teeth back with him to Philadelphia, where he died in his sleep the night before his lecture, mouth locked open, gums flowering with unfamiliar growths, and the hotel maid who discovered him swore she heard a sound, faint but unmistakable, rising from the back of his throat, chewing, steady, rhythmic, joyful. In the winter of 1926, when the frost had hardened the soil into plates of brittle black glass, and the few remaining villagers had boarded their windows against the moaning that now seemed to rise not from the wind, but from somewhere older and closer, a small chapel appeared overnight on the eastern ridge of Briar Hollow, unmarked on any map, unrequested by any faithful, and though its walls were made of stone familiar to the area, its construction bore none of the imperfections of human labor. The stones fit together without mortar, their surfaces so smooth and cold they wept in sunlight, and at its center, replacing what should have been an altar, stood a column of fused teeth, molars, canines, incisors, stacked not in chaos, but in an ascending spiral, as if the dental remains of countless mouths had been drawn upward in prayer, building a spire of hunger crowned by a single gold crown etched with a cross turned inward. The chapel had no doors, only an arched opening that inhaled fog, with a sound like wet paper tearing, and those who approached described a strange sensation, not fear, but yearning, as though the structure itself remembered them, as though it had waited, patient and unblinking, for generations of silence to ripen into invitation. And when Father Laughlin, the last parish priest brave or broken enough to enter, stepped across the threshold, he did so not with his Bible, but with bare hands and an old incisor wrapped in muslin which he placed reverently at the base of the column before kneeling and pressing his forehead against the cool enamel of the tower, remaining motionless for several hours until the sun dipped low and the chapel emitted a low groan, as if adjusting its shape to accommodate breath. He returned changed. His hair had turned white, not from fright but from some deeper bleaching, and he would not speak above a whisper, claiming that his chapel had no roof because it had not yet finished growing, that the mouths from which the teeth had come had not all fallen silent, and that until every Murphy son, past, present, and future, had answered the call, the tower would remain open, a beacon for what he called the apostolate of the hidden root, a congregation of those bound not by scripture, but by dental inheritance. He began to preach without text, sermons composed of long vowels and low hums, tones that vibrated the teeth of his listeners, even those who had never heard the Murphy name before, and it was said that, under his gaze, molars loosened slightly, as if eager to be offered. On the 3rd Sunday of Lent, he asked each parishioner to place their oldest tooth in the offering plate. By Easter, the plate had become a bowl. By Pentecost, it was an ossuary. And beneath the chapel, under the altar of enamel and root, a humming began, steady, sacred, mechanical in its rhythm, like the turning of a great jaw chewing not flesh, but time itself. They say if you kneel there today and place your ear to the floor, you will not hear your own breath or heartbeat. You will hear someone else's, and they are waiting for yours to stop. In a glass case inside the Benedictine archives of La Trobe Abbey, sealed, unsigned, and accessible only to those possessing both permission and ignorance, rests a book unlike any other known to ecclesiastical study, a bound volume of unknown origin, unmarked by publisher or scribe, wrapped in a flesh-like leather that resists classification, and whose spine is composed not of stitched threads but of articulated gum tissue, pink and veined and still damp to the touch, pulsing faintly beneath the surface like something too stubborn to die. And it is this volume, catalogued only as Codex Dentata, that holds the most coherent account of the Murphy lineage's unholy covenant, though reading it comes at great cost, for the pages must be turned not by fingers, but by teeth. The book does not open to the willing. It must be bitten. The reader must press their incisors to the lower corner of the first page and tug gently, an act which causes the parchment to curl away like skin in heat, revealing scripture written in dark resin that smells faintly of myrrh and milk but bleeds when exposed to direct sunlight, and the words themselves change subtly depending on who reads them, as if the book speaks only in the dialect of ancestral guilt, addressing each reader not with facts, but with reflections of what their blood already knows, but has never dared to remember. Contained within are liturgies not meant for breath, rites shaped in negative space, prayers to be thought backward, and muttered only in rooms without mirrors. And through it all, threaded across margins and footnotes in red ink that stings the eyes, is a repeated phrase. The tongue is but a root, the root is but a servant. And beneath that, another line, written in what appears to be hair. Mouths are not for speech, they are for opening. Of the 11 recorded readers of the Codex, only 2 retained their sanity, and even they bore changes. One lost all her molars in her sleep and claimed she had been told she no longer needed them, while the other ceased speaking altogether, choosing instead to communicate through hums and scratches in the wall, which, when played through a phonograph, produced a pattern almost identical to the hymn found in the ossuary beneath Briar Hollow's chapel. Those who dared to copy passages discovered that the ink dried into powder that reanimated when touched by saliva. One archivist, attempting to translate a page aloud, coughed up a black worm woven with teeth. Another was found gnawing at the corners of the abbey pews, whispering that the book wanted out, that it was never meant to be read, only remembered, like a wound or a taste. It is said that deep within the Codex's final chapters, pages that no reader has ever turned without vomiting blood, there lies a diagram of a new cathedral, one not built of stone or timber, but of mouths, a map to construct the final body of worship from tongues, jaws, gums, and song. And once completed, the book claims the final sermon will be spoken not in words, but in the sound of every Murphy tooth returning to the place it was first promised, chewed into dust, and swallowed by silence. By the time the last child was christened in the stone font of Briar Hollow's parish chapel, an unmarked girl whose lineage was later tied by blood to both the Murphy name and something older that had never borne a surname, there were already rumors that the water itself had turned, not in color, but in behavior. For though it appeared as clear and cold as ever, the priests who performed the sacraments began to notice strange phenomena. Condensation forming upward from the font's rim, as if the water exhaled breath, tiny rings of ripples swirling even in stillness, and on rare occasions, the sound of a low murmur, like a voice speaking just beneath the surface, never loud enough to discern words, but always rhythmic, persuasive, like a litany that didn't need to be understood to be obeyed. The font, carved from a single block of pale granite rumored to have been taken from a collapsed Celtic tomb, had always been heavy with presence, its surface worn smooth not just from the water, but from generations of trembling hands. And yet in its final years, witnesses began to claim that when children were lowered into the basin, their eyes would roll back, not in fright, but in recognition, as if they were recalling something long ago promised and now fulfilled. And once, according to the trembling journal of Deacon Bray, a baby dipped into the water opened its mouth wide and smiled, not with joy, but with familiarity. And in that brief moment, the deacon swore he saw, pressed against the child's tongue, a perfectly formed adult tooth crowned in gold which dissolved into saliva before anyone else could look. After that, no more baptisms were performed. The font was drained, consecrated again with salt and prayer, sealed with wax from the paschal candle, and covered with a white shroud that bore the faint image of a single open mouth embroidered in red thread, an image that did no appear until the cloth had lain there undisturbed for 40 nights, as if the linen itself had absorbed some memory of the sacrament now forbidden. Yet the murmuring continued. Even with the font sealed, the sound rose up through the stone, growing louder with each year of silence, and when the rector's cat disappeared and was later found curled within the empty basin, its jaw unhinged and every tooth missing as if plucked one by one in gratitude or sacrifice, the villagers ceased entering the chapel entirely, claiming they felt something watching from beneath the marble floor, not with eyes, but with intent, a kind of ancient awareness that did not need form to touch them. One evening, a storm split the roof open above the font, and rain poured down in a column of sudden fury, yet none of the water remained within. It vanished instantly, absorbed or perhaps accepted, and the next morning the font was full again, not of water, but of fine white dust, warm to the touch and humming softly with a tune only children seemed to recognize, many of them humming it in their sleep, swaying as if rocked in unseen arms. From then on, the font was known not as a vessel of rebirth, but as a mouth that remembered every name ever whispered into its waters. And beneath that memory something deeper stirred, not to forgive, but to feed. Buried deep within the sealed archives of the now dissolved Archdiocese of Allegheny, behind vaults lined with lead and incense-soaked oak, there exists a manuscript without title or attribution, penned in ancient ecclesiastical shorthand, interspersed with crude illustrations and obscure glossolalia, believed by certain scholars of forbidden liturgy to predate the Church's founding itself, and within its final chapter, torn at the edges and stained with what tests could never identify, there lies a passage known only as the Covenant of the Unbitten Tongue, a doctrine so sacrilegious it was never spoken aloud, a creed written not for the faithful, but for those whose mouths were never meant to close, who were born not to praise, but to pronounce something older than creation, and far more intimate than sin. The covenant begins not with commandments, but with a description of a figure clad in vestments of stitched lips, standing at the edge of a cliff made entirely of cracked molars, gazing down into a chasm where language has collapsed into echo. And it is said that this figure, known as the fifth witness, holds in one hand a severed tongue that has never tasted blood, and in the other a flame that sings without burning, and that to accept the covenant is not to speak, but to let the body become a mouth through which older voices may return, not to haunt, but to finish what the living never dared begin. It is believed that the Murphy family, somewhere in the 4th generation, came into possession of this manuscript, not as readers, but as inheritors, and that the covenant was not made by them, but through them, signed not with ink, but with teeth, pressed into flesh like a reverse Eucharist, sealing them not in salvation, but in memory, and that from the moment the first son reached 21 and offered his final breath in silence, the family ceased to be a lineage and became a vessel, a moving mouth, a sermon with limbs. Those who encountered the Murphy men in their final days, always pale, always calm, described an unsettling stillness, as if they were waiting for something specific. Not death, but permission to release what had been coiled behind their tongues since birth. And there were tales, never officially documented, of boys who, on the night before their 21st birthday, would sit in fields alone, mouths full of broken rosary beads, whispering in unison with the wind words no one had taught them, words that made the ground crack and old bones rise like roots straining toward communion. When Emmett, the son who would not die, was asked, by the only priest who dared speak the family's name, what covenant had been made, he replied, not with defiance, but with solemn clarity, "We agreed to remember him who spoke before words." And at that moment, his breath fogged the window pane not with mist, but with letters, looped, ancient, carved in condensation. And though the priest could not translate them, he recognized the final symbol, a tongue held between two teeth, unbitten. Unbitten because it was still waiting to be loosed. And when the priest looked back into Emmett's eyes, he found not reflection, but a mirror of his own mouth, wide open, smiling, filled with silence, ready to speak. There once hung above Briar Hollow a bell so massive, so blackened with age and soot and forgotten blessings, that its tolling could once be heard from 4 valleys away, cast in a foundry that no longer exists, engraved not with saints or scripture, but with untranslatable runes that spiraled upward like smoke. And it was this bell suspended within the chapel's decaying steeple that rang each time a Murphy boy was born, its chime never soft or jubilant, but thick, funereal, as though announcing not life, but an agreement remembered by the stone itself. And beneath this bell, sealed into the rotting timbers of the belfry floor, hidden behind planks carved with reversed psalms and gnawed edges, lay a cradle no one admitted to building, crafted of bone and gold-flecked enamel, its rails shaped like praying fingers, and its base a hollow trough, filled not with straw, but with molars still warm to the touch. The cradle, according to surviving correspondence between two unknown priests, letters marked to be burned unread, yet preserved through divine or infernal negligence, was said to rock without wind and hum with a pitch that only the unborn could hear, and it was believed that before each male heir of the Murphy line drew breath, he lay not in a womb but within that cradle, soul tethered to bone, flesh spun around prophecy, and that the bell's toll was not a blessing but a summons, calling forth not life from darkness, but memory from marrow, as if each child arrived not as a new thing, but as the latest verse in a litany too ancient to be written. Some claimed that the bell was no bell at all, but a tongue cast in iron, held silent until the mouth that housed it was ready once again to speak. And the ringing, so deep it made the earth shiver, was not a sound, but a name, one syllable per generation, spoken slowly across centuries, so that when the final Murphy fell, the name would be complete, and the mouth beneath the hollow could open at last and sing. There was an attempt once to melt the bell, to silence it forever. In 1932, a fire was set deliberately, and though the chapel's roof burned to charcoal, and the steeple groaned and cracked, the bell remained suspended, its surface untouched, its inscription glowing faintly in the dark like wet teeth under candlelight. And the man who started the blaze was found days later, curled beside the cradle, lips gnawed away, mouth full of ash and his own fingernails, hands clutched around a tooth that was not his, larger than any human molar, still bleeding. Since then, no one has dared touch the bell, though it no longer rings by human hand. And yet, every 7th year, on the night when the moon turns bone-white and hangs low over the hollow, it tolls exactly once, vibrating through stone, marrow, and silence. Not a call to prayer, not a warning, but a reminder that something still rocks in the cradle, waiting to be named. In the vestry of the ruined chapel, buried beneath dust and rat-eaten vestments, there lies a ledger so old its leather cover is now indistinguishable from the altar wood it once rested upon, and though many believe it was simply a book of parish records, baptisms, marriages, deaths, the truth, uncovered only by those foolish or devout enough to open its pages, is that it was never meant to record life, but rather to mark the slow progression of something growing beneath the town, something that required not worship but acknowledgement. And so each name inscribed within was not a line in a holy registry, but a thread in a much older tapestry, each letter formed with ink that darkened over time into something thick, clotted, and faintly sweet, as though drawn not from quill or bottle, but from veins willingly opened. The ledger does not accept all hands. When touched by the wrong fingers, those without the mark behind the ear or the silence in the breath, it simply closes itself, its pages stiffening, its spine cracking with a low, wet sound. And should the unchosen persist, the book begins to bleed from the edges, crimson seeping across the names as if erasing their belonging, as if the book itself were rejecting the uninitiated, refusing to be read by those not already part of the covenant it documents. Each entry, upon examination, appears mundane at first glance. Dates, sacraments, simple notes about behavior or family lineage, but closer inspection reveals subtle shifts. Births are always listed as reawakenings, deaths marked not with crosses but with tiny etched mouths, and in the margins, invisible under light but revealed under breath or oil, are additional notations in an ancient script, curving like roots or veins, recording not events but thoughts, dreams, hungers, and every 7 pages, a blank sheet interrupts the flow, cold to the touch, soft as skin, bearing only a faint throb, as if waiting to receive new blood. One priest, Father Mullaney, obsessed with decoding the ledger's hidden tongue, discovered that each blank page corresponded to a Murphy death at the age of 21, and that with each entry, the ink grew thicker, the names longer, as if absorbing not just identity, but experience. And in a moment of blasphemous clarity, he believed the book itself was learning to remember for the family, that it was becoming their archive, not of deeds or dates, but of bone, muscle, and scream. He added his own name. And 3 days later, He lost all memory of himself, walking the woods barefoot, reciting the names of every Murphy boy who had ever died, his voice shrill and joyous, as though remembering were a kind of hunger finally fed. The book is still there, closed, waiting. It smells faintly of iron and lavender, and when the wind moves through the vestry, the pages sometimes shift on their own, as if breathing, slowly, deliberately, like lungs filled not with air, but with confession. And should you ever find it, don't write your name. It will finish the word without you. There was a time, though no one dares say precisely when the hollow itself began to sing, not with wind or birdsong, but with a low, harmonic hum that seemed to rise not from the trees or the soil, but from beneath the very bedrock, as if the mouth of the valley had unhinged in sleep and begun to dream aloud. And this sound, subtle at first, would deepen with the dusk, resonating in walls, window panes, even within the hollow bones of those who listened too long, until it became impossible to tell whether the melody was coming from outside the house or from within the skull, vibrating softly in the jaw, humming behind the teeth like a lullaby meant for the dead. It became known, among those few still left in Briar Hollow, as the choir, though no one had seen its singers, and the hymns, if they could be called that, contained no words, only vowel-shaped moans and long sustained notes that bent at the end like something straining to remain beautiful while descending into sorrow. And yet, inexplicably, those who heard it often wept, not from fear, but from recognition, claiming they had heard the same tune once, long ago, perhaps in the womb or in the moment between breath and sleep, and that it named something they could not remember wanting. As the years passed, the hum grew more insistent, and it was discovered by a blind widow named Elsie Wren, who slept with her ear pressed to the floor, that the sound followed no earthly path, but seemed instead to spiral upward from the defunct ossuary beneath the Murphy Chapel, traveling through the soil like water, blooming in the mouths of animals, children, and once, horrifically, through the open throat of a man whose larynx had been surgically removed years before, and who was found upright in his chair, eyes rolled back, mouth agape, and issuing from him a perfect chord that shook the lanterns on the wall. One brave arch. Evist attempted to record the hum on wax cylinder, and though the device appeared to capture no sound, its needle continued to move after the room had fallen silent, inscribing not a song, but a pattern, a repetition of shapes, curved like tongues and looped like umbilical cords, which, when traced and placed over the layout of the town, revealed something horrifying. Every house, every field, every grave had been arranged not by chance, but in the shape of a human jaw. Teeth aligned, chapel seated where the tongue would rest, and the bell tower placed exactly where the uvula might have hung, suggesting that Briar Hollow itself was not a town, but an open mouth, a mouth now beginning to breathe. And still the choir sang, not louder, but closer, until the walls of the homes began to peel, the nails began to rust from within, and infants born in silence came into the world already mouthing along with the melody, even before they drew breath, as if the song was older than lungs. Some say that if you hum along with it, the pitch will shift slightly, not to match you, but to listen. And if you stop, it doesn't. It keeps singing, just behind your teeth. Among the many relics recovered, though never publicly displayed, from the ruined Murphy estate during the diocesan inquiry of 1953, none confounded the investigators more than a mannequin-sized figure discovered in a sealed chamber beneath the north wing, a figure dressed in a bridal gown of yellowing lace and frayed linen, its face veiled in an intricate mesh of ivory strips woven not from fabric but from what appeared to be hundreds of small, bleached teeth, each one sewn delicately into the pattern like pearls on a rosary. And beneath this veil, when at last it was lifted, though only briefly and by gloved hand, was not the face of a statue or effigy, but a smooth, featureless plane of polished bone, unbroken by eye sockets, mouth, or nose, as if the figure had not been carved, but grown around the absence of a face. They called it the bride. No record of a wedding ever existed. No Murphy woman was unaccounted for. And yet, in the margins of several parish birth records, written in faded ink and signed only with a looping B, there were notations that read, "She was chosen," and "Her mouth was pure," and further down, a darker phrase, "Her silence was the dowry. According to Father Deligan's surviving notes, smuggled out before the inquiry was sealed, the chamber in which the bride stood was arranged like a crypt, though no corpses were found, only 7 chairs carved from dark pine, each bearing a nameplate etched with a Murphy boy's name and age at death. Everyone, 21, and surrounding the chairs were candles made not of wax, but of rendered marrow, each one lit and still burning, though the chamber had been sealed for at least 4 decades, suggesting either miracle or transgression. The bride stood at the center, head bowed, arms open, and clasped in her right hand was a key, not to a door or a lock, but to a jawbone, perfectly human, hinged and yellow. Which she held as one might hold a bouquet, the key fitted directly into the socket where a molar should have been, as if ready to unlock a mouth that had never been given permission to open. She was later moved, against multiple advisories, to a diocesan vault in Pittsburgh, where she has since been observed by select theologians and archivists, each of whom reported strange occurrences during their time with her. Dreams of being swallowed whole, an unexplainable loosening of their own teeth, and in one case, a wedding band appearing on a woman's finger overnight, engraved with the phrase, "For he waits in silence," despite her having never married. What remains most disturbing is that the bride, though never built to move, changes position imperceptibly. At first, her arms were open. Then, they were folded. Now they are reaching upward, and in the veil, new teeth have begun to appear, smaller, sharper, not sewn but fused, suggesting she is not collecting but growing, and that the mouth behind the veil is not empty. It is forming. And when it is complete, she will not speak. She will bite. In the winter of 1961, when snow fell without pause for 9 days, and even the crows seemed to vanish from the sky, a man arrived in Briar Hollow by foot, cloaked, hunched, dragging behind him a wooden box bound in rusted chain, claiming to be a Murphy son, long thought dead, believed to have perished in a mining collapse decades earlier, and yet, as he stood before the abandoned chapel, pale as a winter birch and smiling with a mouth too wide, no one could quite recall his name or features, only that something in their bones recoiled as if the earth itself remembered him more clearly than the flesh ever could. For where his eyes should have been, there were smooth, hollow sockets, not scarred or empty, but clean, as if something sacred had reached inside and taken them with purpose. He spoke little and never blinked. His voice was flat, but carried distance, each word pressing into the air like a thumb into wax. And though he claimed to have no memory of the mine, of his supposed death, or of the years in between, he knew every name etched on the Murphy headstones, recited backwards, beginning not with the most recent, but with the first. And when asked why he had returned, he answered only, "I was called back to finish what was swallowed." Over the course of 7 nights, he visited each structure tied to his family's past. The cradle beneath the bell, the ledger in the vestry, the sealed ossuary beneath the altar. And each time he emerged, something had changed. Doors warped, floors blistered, even the very air grew heavier, as if time itself slowed in protest. And on the final night, he stood in the center of the now collapsing chapel and opened the wooden box he had dragged with him, revealing not tools, not books, but a collection of 21 perfect teeth, each with a golden root and carved with minute inscriptions in a language that burned the eye when stared at. Too long. He placed them, one by one, into the gaps left in the altar's stone base. And as he did, the temperature dropped so sharply that the breath of every animal in the hollow hung suspended in the air, motionless, as if waiting. When the final tooth clicked into place, the chapel began to hum, not loud, not frantic, but deep and slow, a sound felt more than heard, like a memory unfolding in the marrow. And the man, the son without eyes, turned to no one in particular and said, "Now it remembers," then vanished. He was never seen again, though some claim they hear him still, in dreams or in the slow cracking of old wood at night, whispering through walls in that same flat voice. And in the decades since, children born in the hollow, those few who still arrive, have begun to hum before they speak, have dreams filled with tunnels and white teeth glistening like lanterns, and some are born without eyes, or with too many. It is said that the son did not return to rejoin the family. He returned to prepare the mouth. There exists a hill beyond the eastern edge of Briar Hollow, now grown over with knotgrass and bramble, known only to those whose ancestors whispered of it as Bone Hill, a place shunned even by animals, where snow never lingers and the soil remains warm in winter, not with life, but with memory. And though no parish ever claimed it and no map dares name it, those who have stood at its crest on the right kind of night have reported the unmistakable sensation of breath on their neck, of voices not in the ear but beneath the skin, reciting in perfect synchrony a liturgy never learned, only inherited. It is here that, once every 7 decades, always beneath a moon veiled in mist, an unspoken mass is said to occur, not officiated by clergy, but by those who never died properly. Men and women lost in mines, drowned in the river, forgotten between generations, whose mouths were never closed with coin or prayer, who rise, not fully formed, but shaped by want and waiting, to recite the verses of the body, not in words, but in gestures and breath, and in the cracking of their own joints, which echo across the field like a choir of breaking ribs. Witnesses, few and now voiceless, have described a circle of figures standing motionless around a central pit, from which rises a pillar of smoke shaped like a jaw unhinged, open not in scream but in sermon, and at its base, arranged in a perfect ring, lie hundreds of teeth, not scattered but placed, some human, some not, all humming with a tone that can be heard only by those whose ancestors bled before the bell tolled. The Mass does not begin, for it has never truly ended. It continues, paused by time, resumed by blood, and those caught in its radius, those foolish enough to tread Bone Hill unaware, report sensations of swelling in the gums, sudden loosening of the jaw, and in one horrific account, a man who claimed he felt the prayers not in his ears, but in his teeth, each verse chewing itself into place until he collapsed, mouth open, filled with hymns made of molars. The ground is said to breathe there. Not metaphorically, but with actual rise and fall, as if beneath the grass, the land itself were inhaling slowly through the cracks between rocks, waiting for the congregation to grow full enough to be devoured in unison. And at the center of it all, just beneath the surface, lies a stone slab shaped like a tongue, wide, slick, veined with quartz and blackened iron, on which is carved the liturgy's final line: "When the last tooth falls, he will speak." No one knows who he is. Some believe it is the origin of the Murphy curse, others that it is not a man, not even a god, but a mouth too vast to be formed in flesh, a hunger older than Scripture. The unspoken Mass has no beginning and no end. It is waiting in the spaces between names. It is forming in the mouths of children, and when it is sung in full, it will not echo, it will swallow. Hidden within the collapsed tower of the old rectory, beneath layers of soot-darkened timber and shattered stained glass once depicting the martyrdom of Saint Apollonia, patroness of dental suffering, there was discovered by accident in 1987 a strange mechanical device, half clock, half altar, encased in a coffin-shaped cabinet of blackened walnut, its surface carved with looping tongues and spirals of human incisors set like constellations, and at its center, behind a pane of fogged crystal, ticked a mechanism of unknown design, whose gears were made not of brass or steel, but of polished enamel and tarnished gold, each tooth gear engraved with tiny liturgical symbols, some matching medieval Eucharistic prayers, others so archaic they predated Christian scripture altogether, and though no mainspring or power source could be found, the clock ticked ceaselessly, measuring not hours or days, but something far older, something that moved not forward but inward. Those who studied the object, members of the Diocesan Obscura, a secret ecclesiastical order tasked with cataloging and suppressing cursed relics, soon realized that the clock did not mark time as mortals understood it, but rather tracked the decay of a lineage, each tick representing a tooth lost, a name forgotten, a silence deepened, and at the 12th rotation of the smallest dial, a compartment opened slowly, revealing not a chime, but a sigh, a hot gust of fetid breath that extinguished candles and left behind a fine mist of blood dust that settled on nearby surfaces in the shape of open mouths. At the bottom of the clock face, etched in reverse Latin, were the words, tempus est manducare, which roughly translates as it is time to eat. And beneath that, a symbol known only in one forbidden Benedictine text, a circle within a circle, surrounded by 21 points, each representing a son of the Murphy line, Ea, each meant to fall in turn like teeth from a dying jaw until the final gap remained, and the mouth was made ready. The ninth apostle, referenced only once in a marginal note by a Carthusian mystic in 1314, was said to have no scripture, no followers, no miracles, only hunger, and those who bore his mark, a double canine pressed beneath the tongue at birth, were not called to teach or heal, but to count, to keep record of a hunger passed down, and to ring the final bell when the mouth was complete. The tooth clock, it is believed, was not made to track mortal lives, but to signal the moment of reopening, of re-speaking. And when the final Murphy sun is placed beneath soil or stone, the clock's final tooth gear will fall, the cabinet will unseal, and inside there will be no relic, no artifact. There will only be a mouth, still warm, still waiting. And in that mouth will be the true name of the hollow, written not in ink, but in nerves and song, a name that, once spoken, will turn every silence into appetite, and the clock will stop ticking, because time, at last, will have been devoured. They say the last Murphy, the final heir to a name soaked through with graves, baptisms, unvoiced hymns, and mouths sealed in salt, was born under an eclipsed moon in a town that refused to speak its own name, to parents who disappeared from hospital records within hours of his birth, as if the act of delivering him into the world had also delivered them out of it. And the midwife who held him swore that his first breath was not taken in, but given out, exhaled not in a cry, but in a soundless whisper that turned her milk white with age and caused every mirror in the birthing room to crack inwards, reflecting not the child's face, but an open mouth stretching impossibly wide, ringed with teeth too numerous to count. He was raised in silence, his guardians selected not for their warmth but for their absence of sound, and it was understood, though never spoken, that no birthday would be celebrated, no candles lit, no songs sung, and that he was to remain unkissed, unnamed in public, untouched by church or school, kept away from photographs, from anything that might record or reflect him, because it had long been believed by those who still held the old whispers close to the bone that the final Murphy son must reach his 21st year unspoiled by memory, unanchored by affection, unbroken by love, so that his mouth might open not in resistance, but in perfect submission to the hunger that had been waiting for him since the first tooth fell into the altar of the hollow. On the night of his 21st birthday, there were no visitors, no letters, no cake, only the slow rising of fog from the river, and a choir of night-birds who fell silent all at once, just before midnight, as if the very air had made room for something older to breathe. And in that silence, he stood in the center of his family's ruined chapel, barefoot, eyes closed, listening not for a voice, but for the hush, the absence of it. And when the final moment arrived, when the clock in the ossuary ceased ticking and the last candle flickered into shadow, he opened his mouth. He did not scream. He inhaled, and in that breath the names of all those buried without stone, the songs hummed behind teeth too afraid to speak, the contracts etched in blood behind altar panels, the sighs of brides without grooms, and the ticking of the tooth clock, all of it entered him, filled him, bloated his lungs with centuries of silence pressed into hymns. Then, slowly, reverently, he exhaled. And in that breath came the first true word the hollow had ever spoken, a word not heard by ears, but by bone, a word that made stone ripple and glass melt and rivers run backwards for 9 heartbeats, a word shaped like a jaw. And that breath is still moving, still carried on winds that seem too warm for the season, in echoes behind your own breath when you're alone, in the hush between verses, in the stillness of the fog that pools at your door. Because his breath was not a farewell, it was an opening, and the next breath will be yours. There is a silence, older than death, deeper than the grave, heavier than stone, and it lives not in the ground nor in the sky, but within us, folded behind the tongue, etched into the hollows of the jawbone, sleeping beneath the soft flesh of the throat. And when the final Murphy sun exhaled the ancestral breath, It was not merely a sigh or a release, but an unlocking, a sacred reversal, the first note in a liturgy that does not rise upward to heaven, but sinks downward, into marrow, into the shared inheritance of silence we all carry unknowingly inside our teeth. And with that breath, the world did not end, but began again, not forward, but backward, as if language itself had remembered what it meant to hunger. In the days that followed, no bells rang and no headlines declared the moment, but all across the valley things began to shift imperceptibly. The fog, once occasional, now thickened nightly and clung to windows with a wetness like breath. Animals refused to eat unless fed by hand. And in every mirror, just beneath the surface of reflection, there emerged a second mouth, not screaming, not smiling, but watching, as if waiting for you to speak first, to finish a sentence it had begun centuries ago, beneath the altar stones of Briar Hollow. The chapel collapsed inwards, not in ruin but in closure, as though it had fulfilled its purpose and now folded itself shut, like a book no longer needed. And from its remains came no smoke, no fire, only silence, rich and warm and full, like a mouth pressed to your ear and humming a lullaby your blood remembered, but your mind had never heard. And in that silence, those who lingered too long claimed they could feel their teeth shifting slightly, aligning, responding to something unspoken, but terribly close. No body was found, no stone was placed, only a ring of dust, fine and white, arranged in the shape of an open jaw, and without in that circle, no birds would land, no shadow would fall, and those who stood too close swore they heard their own names whispered, not once, but 3 times, each softer than the last, until it became unclear whether the sound had ever come from outside themselves at all, or had simply always been there, waiting. Letters began to arrive in towns surrounding the hollow. No return address, no handwriting, only a single tooth enclosed in black cloth and a note reading, "He remembers what we forgot." Some threw them away, some buried them, but a few, too curious, too empty, held the teeth in their palms, and in doing so, felt warmth, felt memory, felt something settle behind their molars like a forgotten prayer, and afterward they could no longer hum without weeping. And now the silence spreads, not like plague, but like inheritance, quiet and inevitable, passed from breath to breath, not to kill, but to consecrate, so that every open mouth may someday become a chapel, every tongue a parchment, every tooth a sacred letter in the name that has not yet finished being spoken. And wherever you are now, reading, listening, remembering, you must understand. The hollow is no longer a place, but a condition, and it lives in you already, in your sleep, in your silence, in the part of your voice you never use. Because the story never ends. It only waits. And the mouth? The mouth never closes. Not once it learns how to speak without sound. Not once it begins to open. Backwards.